A very good evening to you. Welcome to this special Human Rights Day episode of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. Tonight on the program, we'll look at the country's human rights record, 28 years into democracy. My first guest is the founding chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, Professor Bani Pityana. After that conversation, we have a roundtable where community-based organizations dealing with human rights issues on a daily basis take us through lived experiences of ordinary people. We also bring you snippets from today's commemorative events that took place around the country. All that coming up in today's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. The history of Human Rights Day is grounded in the Sharpeville massacre that took place on the 21st of March 1960, where apartheid police shot and killed 69 people and wounded 180. In a peaceful protest march in Sharpeville, they had gathered in protest against the then passed laws. Following the dawn of democracy in 1994, the democratic government declared March 21 Human Rights Day to commemorate and honor those who fought for our liberation and the rights we enjoy today. 2 years later, the South African Human Rights Commission was also established to promote respect for human rights, promote the protection, development, and attainment of human rights, as well as monitor and assess the observance of human rights in South Africa. Professor Bani Pityana became the Commission's first chairperson, and he joins us today for some reflections.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Well, I still remember the day I called you, congratulating you on your appointment as the chairperson of the newly established at the time Human Rights Commission. Take us back to how it all started, how the commission was put together, and really the marching orders, as it were, that you were given.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. I really do appreciate the opportunity to recognize and to inform the people of South Africa about the Human Rights Commission and where it comes from, because it's now 28 years, as you said, almost 28 years since it was founded. It was put together, I think, very carefully in the administration of Nelson Mandela, as a body that actually represents and reflects the totality of South Africa. In the Human Rights Commission those days were people who were either members of the African National Congress or inclined to the African National Congress. They were members of the National Party, Conservative Party, and all the other parties that were there were fairly represented. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that it was very, very important that not only did we wish to be seen to be a body that, as it were, protects human rights. We were also a body that enforces human rights, enables people to know what human rights are. Enforcement mechanisms were there part of that constitution. I think the third thing we wanted to do, we wanted to educate people about human rights. And finally, I think it's important for me to say, it was very, very important for us that we be seen and we act as an independent body, that we're not body that was beholden to government or any structure of the state at that time. And we had a responsibility to report, of course, through the Minister of Justice to Parliament, which we did. But we wrestled with the idea of independence a great deal. Those days for us, resources were a big problem, and we understood that coming as we did into the new South Africa, resources indeed were a problem. But I think in the time we did some major things. We were part of the inquiries on poverty. We went up and down the country together with the NGOs, Sangoko, that Kumi Naidu was leading at that time. And we went and made an inquiry about the nature and extent of poverty. I think that if that report had been taken seriously, we would have had a strategy as South Africa by now of how to actually deal with poverty as a violation of human rights. You know, of course, that we did a major inquiry on racism in the media. And it was indeed a big problem for us, for the country post-apartheid, to be conscious of the racism that was prevalent in society at that time. And this turned out, unbeknown to us, that this turned out to be a very controversial project, that we never thought it would be controversial. Because it really, as far as the media practitioners were concerned, they saw this as an attack on the right to free speech and on the right to journalism. I remember Mr. Lowe and others campaigning very, very strongly against this and not to participate. And we were ready, we got to the point where we were going to subpoena people to come and appear before us, before in fact wiser voices prevailed, and we were able to come to an agreement with SANEF and other media organizations. And I think it turned out to be a very good thing to conscientize the media themselves about the impact of the work of the media in society in general. And of course, one of the things we set up was what I'd like to call an institute. It was not an institute at that time, an institute for human rights education. And some of my colleagues worked very hard on human rights education. And we designed a mechanism of how the Human Rights Commission would work. First of all, we divided ourselves and took responsibility for each of the provinces, so that each province had a human rights commissioner, as it were. The second thing we did, we made sure that besides the commission, there were also various issues that were important. So a human rights commissioner had to look at, for example, the elderly, the people with disability, to look at education, to look at healthcare issues, to focus on healthcare issues, to focus on education and the state of education in our country, and to focus on people with disability. And that way, we were able, I think, to make the Human Rights Commission visible and very much in touch with everything that was happening in the country. And for that reason, I think in a short space of time, I was there for 6 years before I left to go to the human rights, to the University of South Africa. But I think in that time and after me, when Shirley Mabusela and Jody Colapan took over, they actually raised the profile of the commission a lot further than it had been when I was there as chairperson.
Thank you, Prof. For that background, and I want us to look into some of those things that you've raised. And I'm going to start with the issue of independence, because a widely held belief among South Africans is that perhaps the first administration that was led by the late Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was perhaps the most upright right administration. It had moral authority, but perhaps carried itself a lot better than the administrations that followed. And it's interesting that one of the things you, as you put it, wrestled with as the commission was the issue of independence.
Well, we did. We wrestled with that very much. We were, in fact, probably the most assured of independence as a commission in the administration of Nelson Mandela. I think Advocate Dalla Omar understood in fact, he was the only Minister of Justice that I know who really understood what we were talking about when we were raising the issue of independence. He agreed with us. Nelson Mandela agreed with us that independence was important. So important, for example, that the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission was not elected by the president, was not appointed by the president. The chairperson of the Human Rights Commission was elected by the members of the commission. Since I left, for a reason I don't understand, I wasn't there, the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission is now, up to this day, appointed by the president. And I really do think that that is offensive to the idea of independence. There were the Paris principles that we sought to make sure that they guided the commission in its independence. We were, in fact, an exemplar of an independent human rights commission across the world, actually, not just across Africa. And as an exemplar of an independent human rights commission, we reported to government, we reported to Parliament directly through the Minister of Justice. We questioned, for example, and Dalla Omar agreed with us. Why was it necessary that we report through the Minister of Justice, for example? He felt that as an independent body, the Human Rights Commission ought not to report to Parliament through the Minister. Of course, the Minister is important to drive the agenda and the budget required by the Human Rights Commission through Parliament. That is important. But he also realized that the Human Rights Commission should not be seen as simply under instruction from government. I remember one occasion during the presidency of President Mbeki, for example. The African National Congress raised an issue, and they said they were going to conduct an inquiry into racism. I then called President Mbeki, went to President Mbeki, and said, I don't think this is the role of a political party. This is the role of an independent body like the Human Rights Commission, and the Human Rights Commission ought to do this work. And so we agreed with him and on a need for a national conference on racism, which we did. And that national conference on racism, which we did, became a precursor to the World Conference on Racism that took place in South Africa. So in those first two administrations of Nelson Mandela and Mbeki and President Mbeki, there was a very, very clear consensus among us that independence was an important factor in the Human Rights Commission. Now, I can say, and I'm prepared to be on record to say, since then, there were really serious questions that were being asked, and correctly so, about the independence of the Commission. To some extent, to this day, those questions are being asked about the independence of the Commission. To what extent, for example, do political parties interfere in who becomes a member of the Commission? To what extent do political parties as it were, make sure that certain political actors of a party who no longer had a place anywhere become members of the commission. Now, I saw no evidence of that in the first and the second administrations that we had in the country. But these days, it's common for an ANC activist who no longer is an MEC or something like that, for whatever reason, and somehow that person is made available to the commission. Yes, there are serious questions that must be raised about the independence of the Human Rights Commission today. I mean, to have a former member of parliament to come to the commission and indeed to become a chairperson of the commission raises very, very serious questions about the independence of the commission.
Well, the other issue, of course, I mean, you spoke about earlier was how it was important for the commission to represent, as you put it, the totality of South Africans. In the context of a government of national unity at the time, that was perhaps, I mean, the most obvious thing to do. Would you say the same today? That there's still a very important...
I still say that today. The Human Rights Commission represents and must reflect the totality of the people of South Africa. Your political views, your political opinions and all that shouldn't matter in terms of becoming a member of the commission. What should matter is your competence, your understanding of human rights, your ability to translate human rights into programs, your ability to educate the people of this country about human rights, your ability to have the backbone to be a pillar of independence for human rights in our country. And very often this is a problem in many respects today. If I may mention, I'm sorry to do that, from the time of Mr. Mushwana, who had been a public protector, chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, really everything went awry. All the critical principles of the Paris principles were ignored. And the Human Rights Commission was no longer the much respected, worldwide respected commission that it had been.
Prof, you know, going back to the poverty inquiries that you had in collaboration with your South African NGO coalition at the time, where you looked at poverty as a violation of human rights. And considering the fact that poverty, inequality, and unemployment are the three biggies in South Africa today, add to that the fact that you had to have those hearings into racism in the media, and considering again the fact that we are talking, where you and I are having this conversation in the middle of an inquiry that the Human Rights Commission is involved in, involving allegations of racism within the advertising industry. What do these things, what we are seeing today, just on poverty and racism, and going back to that history, the things you had to do right at the beginning, from the onset when the commission was established. Do you get a sense? Do you get to feel that the more things change, the more they stay the same?
I thoroughly applaud the Human Rights Commission, especially on its work on the subtle racism that is there in the media in this country, because it really does affect the thinking of the people of this country very much. I also applaud the Human Rights Commission's work on the July uprisings, which really affected so many people. I really do think that there are important things that the South African Human Rights Commission is doing today that are very, very important for this country. And I do think that we should applaud the Human Rights Commission when it raises its voice on critical issues in our country, because the voice of the Human Rights Commission is important. But the Human Rights Commission is not only about that, it's also about educating the public, the people of the country, about human rights. Now Professor Andre Kiet established a center for the education of human rights at the Human Rights Commission, which was second to none. And the work that he was doing in schools everywhere about human rights education is something that is an ongoing responsibility of the Human Rights Commission. Of course, one of the things that we have to do, which the Commission today does, we have to take up the individual or group complaints of people at human rights violations. We have to do that. I mean, for example, I feel that much of the work that the AfriForum is doing today is actually the work that should be done by the Human Rights Commission. And colleagues actually work very hard. There are some major decisions that were made by the Human Rights Commission. For example, Pensi Tlakula on women and culture in Northwest, for example, or now Justice Jody Kolape on the work that we did on refugees in our country during that time, or Tom Mantata on the work that he did on the elderly in our country. So members of the Commission actually worked in different ways. They both took individual complaints, but they also realized that at the end, it's not about the individual, it's about a culture that is embedded in our society that is not going to go away just because you have dealt with one thing. And you've got to deal with the essence of what the problem is. I've given you some examples, which I may say, of course, the issue of refugees, the issue of asylum seekers is still a problem today. It did not go away. But we found a way of the Human Rights Commission, for example, inspecting Lindela regularly and getting to see how long people stay there, what is the problem and all of that. We got to allow that to happen, which before had not been the case. So I really do believe that individual complaints are important. And I know that the Human Rights Commission today does deal with those individual human rights violations that come to the Commission. And we set up at the Commission at that time, I think, a legal department that was really dealing with these things in a way that I think was legally competent and has never been challenged, to the best of my knowledge, in the courts of our land.
Professor Pityana, let me thank you so much for your time this evening. Professor Pani Pityana, the founding chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, reflecting there on the journey that the Commission has traversed, established in 1996 to promote respect for human rights, to promote the protection, the development and attainment of human rights, but also to monitor and assess the observance of human rights in South Africa. That has been the role, mandate of that Commission, and you heard it from Professor Pityana. He reckons they have done a great job over the years, but of course there's still a lot more that they could still do. And after the break, Sharon Akambaram, who is the head of refugee and migrant rights at Lawyers for Human Rights, as well as Motlatsi Komote, who is a research and advocacy officer at the Women and Democracy Initiative at the Dala Omar Institute. They join us to talk us through, some of the lived experiences of people who come to them seeking help, but also as people who are in this space, they're going to reflect on the things that they see, the things that they have also learned. That's coming up after this short ad break. Don't go away. Well, let's speak now to community-based organizations that deal with human rights issues on a daily basis. And please welcome Sharon Akambaram, who is the head of refugee and migrant rights at the Lawyers for Human Rights, as well as Motlatsi Komote, who is a research and advocacy officer at the Women and Democracy Initiative at the Dala Omar Institute. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for agreeing to come on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me start. Yes, let me start with you, if I may, Motlatsi. In the conversation I was having with Professor Pityana a short while ago, he was talking about how the person whose name your organization carries understood fully, when the Human Rights Commission was established, what it was exactly that South Africa wanted to do through the establishment of the Human Rights Commission as that body that was actually going to take up these issues. From where you sit as an institute, do you believe that over the past 28 years we've actually done well in this area?
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer, because I think in some instances we have performed relatively well, and in other instances we can do better. I mean, the Constitution is a wonderful tool that was created many years ago. But in this current context, I mean, we have a pandemic currently underway, which obviously has affected those human rights quite negatively. But it also presents an opportunity for us to actually rethink and recommit to some of these rights that are found in fact, all of the rights that are found in the Bill of Rights. But I think that there's always more to be done. And our research has indicated, for example, that the legislatures as well our critical space within which to realize those rights as a starting point as well.
Very interesting. I mean, in what ways did the pandemic, from your research, really affect our human rights record?
So in terms of our viewpoint, I mean, we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, there were many PPE scandals, and obviously people did not have access to food, and there were unemployment rates as well. And obviously this has affected everyone, but particularly women, quite negatively. And I mean, women bear the brunt of doing most of the work in most households. And so that has been some of the issues that we've identified. But also, just to take it back into the legislatures, what has subsequently happened is, before COVID, you could walk into either Parliament or the provincial legislatures to some extent and watch the different portfolio committee meetings that were underway, and in some instances even engage with members of Parliament or members of legislatures. But currently you can't do that, and what that has done has meant that the public now has to either access the legislatures through YouTube, for example, which to some extent has had its benefits because it's opened up people who wouldn't technically be able to travel to those particular legislatures. But what it has done as well is it's taken away people's ability to some extent to actively engage and participate in some of the decisions that are being made that affect them. So, for example, now what has subsequently happened is you need data. And so people have to decide between, are they going to spend money on data to access these legislatures and actively and meaningfully participate? Or do they use that money to buy bread or to travel to and from work? So they're quite difficult decisions that have to be made. And I think we really need to start making use of various platforms such as community radio that more people have access to as well.
Sharon, from your vantage point?
I couldn't agree more with Motlatsi. I think that specifically with respect to COVID, what we have witnessed through the work that we do operating law clinics, which give access to justice for the most indigent in our country, which includes South Africans and foreign nationals, that it's been a serious factor that people are struggling to access justice with the lockdown and the various regulations. There's also been a disproportionate impact on the poorest in our country. Again, the regulations have, especially during the initial period, the informal sector, the informal economy was totally shut off to people whose daily existence depends on their ability to wake up in the morning and go and sell their goods or carry out their activities. And this impact has not been quantified in our country. It's not been registered. What a major setback already a very unequal society has suffered, and how can we mitigate and how can we correct that and get people out of extreme poverty. And I think that this is one of the factors that is contributing to the continuing violence in our country that we're witnessing even today with outbreaks of xenophobia and opportunism of movements like Operation Dudula.
And if I may ask Sharon, how would measuring the impact help us going forward? I'm asking because we tend to take these things for granted. Professor Pityana earlier was talking about poverty hearings that they did right from the onset, soon after the Human Rights Commission was established. And lo and behold, there were no follow-ups. And look where we are. Poverty right now is a big problem in our country. So I want you to dwell a little bit on why it is important to measure these things, but also follow through.
I just want to do an aside response to the point around the Chapter 9 institutions and the work that they've been doing. And I think that, Professor Thuli Madonsela was critical in what she said through particularly the work of the public protector and the court ruling on the powers of Chapter 9 institutions. And I think that it's unfortunate that the Chapter 9 institutions do not use the power they have to act on recommendations and findings that can make an impact in particular with respect to human rights. But to answer your question, I think that why we need to quantify this is to speak to your first point, that our Constitution is transformational at its core. It calls for redress for our past. And if we can quantify the disproportionate impact of COVID and the ongoing situation in our country with increasing inequality, then our government is legally obliged, constitutionally obliged to allocate resources accordingly to address those inequalities. And, without dealing with poverty, we can't enjoy the brilliant Bill of Rights and human rights that's enshrined in our Constitution. The majority of our people are living in shocking conditions, facing abject poverty, but also systemic unemployment. And if we have the kind of research that Motlatsi has spoken about, we need to use that in holding our government to account, ensuring that when they do their budgeting, whether it's at local government level, whether it's at provincial level, rather than blaming migrants for our problems, that we have this quantifiably verifiable data to say to our government, these are the reasons why we're living in these conditions. These are the reasons why our service delivery is so poor, and why we will not vote for you if you do not address these issues. We've got to use the power of our vote to strengthen our democracy.
Motlatsi, I mean, from the body of research that organizations like yours, often come up with, what is your sense? In other words, what is responsible for the attitude we are seeing from those who are entrusted with the responsibilities, of looking, after especially the most vulnerable sections of our communities? Is it lack of trying? Is it a devil-may-care attitude? Is it lack of resources? What is exactly responsible for the less than? I mean, for the problems we are actually seeing?
So thank you very much for that question. I must start off by agreeing wholeheartedly with what Sharon has said. In actual fact, I mean, our organization and other organizations that we work with have strongly come out to say that some of the austerity measures that are being implemented in budgeting are part of the problem. So we're taking away critical resources from things that matter, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, and we're taking them taking them to other parts of the work that needs to be done. And part of the challenge there is we need this data for us to be able to decide where the resources must go. It will help us strategically think about where the most of the work or the bulk of the work needs to be done. So I think that to answer your question directly, part of the challenges that we found is a lack of implementation in certain instances of the beautiful laws that we have, or a lack of accountability. And corruption has really added on, and state capture have added on to the challenges that we already had. And I think that when people occupy spaces, they always need to remember, when I say people, I mean people in positions of power, people who've been elected representatives, need to remember that they're not there for the parties, but they're there for the people, and they have a duty to make sure that the people who live in this country, whether they're South African or not, are able to fully enjoy the rights that are found in the Constitution. I mean, when we have previously done work and you go into communities, everybody agrees that the Constitution is a wonderful tool. But when people are faced with hunger, and people are faced with unemployment, and people are faced with immigration challenges, then it's very hard for them to see how the Constitution works for them as people. And I mean, we then have to really decide how we as a country are going to collectively work around this. So different NGOs, for example, at the moment are experiencing a lot of budgetary constraints themselves, and they have to do the work on the ground. So we need to start having the very difficult but necessary conversations continuously around the fact that we need to be equipping people with the necessary tools and the budgets to do the work that they do. So even if, for example, we come in and we have, for example, the National Strategic Plan on violence against women and children, for example, then we also need to have the necessary budgets that actually align with that vision of trying to curb violence against women and children in South Africa. So I think that definitely what we are seeing is a lack of accountability. And sometimes it's also based on the fact that people in positions of power are not willing to listen in certain instances to what people on the ground are saying. So we are a research-based institute, but the people that we work with work on the ground every single day with different communities across different provinces. And the same issues that we identified 5 years ago are similar issues to what we're seeing now. So clearly there's a lack of foresight, there's a lack of implementation, and there's a lack of oversight in certain instances and accountability. So just to draw it back into our work around the legislatures and our research as well, when government departments come and present certain things before Parliament, I mean, it is the duty of MPs to really listen and engage critically with what is being said and calling out the issues that have been identified in the different SOEs or different government departments. And until we have accountability, we're going to be sitting with the same problem that we have been sitting with over the last couple of years.
Well, Sharon, I mean, as Mutlatsi says, we're seeing a lot of things: lack of foresight, lack of accountability. Only a couple of the things that she sees. But we're also seeing Operation Dudulas, where people are rising, coming up against foreign nationals. We're seeing political parties, exploiting people's grievances just to gain votes.
Yes, I think it's, that is a serious crisis of facing us as South Africans, a crisis of humanity. I would like to put it in that way. I think that it's the scramble for votes has been trampling people's right to basic, services. It's been trampling on our human dignity, and we as a country, not just foreign nationals and people who seek refuge in our country. I think there are serious questions about, especially given the report that was done on the violence that took place in June last year, about the lack of resources and capacity for public policing in particular in our country for them to do their work. And so we are very concerned about the unlawful acts that things like Operation Dudula are allowed to do in our country. We have been organizing a march to protest against the xenophobia in our country, Kopenhagen, Africa Against Xenophobia. And our march has been banned. And the reason for that is the police and JMPD say they can't protect us because of all the claims that, in particular, Operation Dudula is making to attack the marchers and to stop the march. Now, this is a democracy. People have died for the Constitution and what it stands for, and for our right to be able to march and protest. So it's indeed a very sad situation, I think, and the police, the law enforcement have to answer for what I would say is a shrinking space for activism, for challenging and for standing up for human rights in our country and indeed in our region.
Mm-hmm. Now, concluding comments from both of you. If I may start with you, Mutlatsi, how do we now, knowing what we know, the things that you so eloquently articulated this evening as being problems, how do we, one, reflect this state of affairs to the nation, and then two, make sure that we stop talking and do something about the things we are seeing and the things we are experiencing and observing? Mutlatsi?
Thank you. So in conclusion from our side, I must say that we need to come out strongly. Both the public and political parties need to come out strongly and speak out against xenophobia and Afrophobia. Now is not the time for us to be saying that these things are right by being silent. We have to strongly come out and call it out for what it is with the utmost, we need to really, really call it out for what it is. And in terms of reflection, I think that there are many inquiries that have been made over the years and reports that have been made around human rights, whether it has been policing, whether it has been the state of human rights in South Africa, and most recently the Zondo Commission. We have all the information that we need. Now is the time for us to implement and see it through, most certainly, not just implement for the next 6 months or the next year, but see it through and see how best we can all work together, but also hold the people in positions of power accountable. We need to start voting with our feet, so to speak, because a lot of people are not seeing the importance of them really voting and voting with their voice critically. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done around that, most certainly. But I think definitely government needs to start listening to people on the ground and listening to, academics as well, who keep on saying the same things. I think that now is the time for us to work together to really deal with the structural issues that we have, which have been further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So definitely we need to keep on less talking and more implementation is what I would definitely say in conclusion.
Sharon?
I would agree with that. I think that we need to immediately see the government to take measures to address the inequalities in our country. And the face of poverty remains that of Black African women. Women working as domestic workers, struggling to get their children to school, and on top of that, bearing the brunt of systemic unemployment in our country. So there has to be more intervention by the state in getting the private sector to contribute to reform in our country for addressing the injustices of the past. A wealth tax that would enable the government to have a basic income grant that would immediately address getting people out of abject poverty and in a position where they can be economically active to get their lives together. I think these are what we need if we are going to enjoy and celebrate human rights in our country.
Special thanks to both of you, Sharon Ekambran, who is from the Lawyers for Human Rights, as well as Mutlatsi Komote from the Dala Omar Institute. Well, we now leave you with snippets from today's commemorations of Human Rights Day that took place across the country. From all of us, good night and do enjoy what's left of your Human Rights Day.